All right, we need the agony over with. Just tell us which house is the winning house.
After much deliberation, we're gonna pick the
two-story house.
He had spent the night writing out his passwords, drafting instructions for his estate, and composing what he believed might be his final message to the woman he loved. Not because of an accident, not because of a sudden diagnosis, but because for over a year, something invisible had been slowly dismantling his life, and on that particular night, he was convinced it had finally come to finish the job. This is not a story about fame or television empires. This is a story about a man named J.D. Scott, who survived something most people never even knew he was going through. If you have ever watched HGTV for more than 30 minutes, the names Jonathan and Drew Scott need no introduction. The Property Brothers built one of the most recognizable brands in television history, charming, tall, renovation-obsessed twins who turned real estate dreams into reality for families across North America. They have multiple shows, a production company, a furniture line, books, podcasts, and an audience that spans the globe. They are, by any measure, a genuine cultural phenomenon. But long before any of that existed, there was an older brother. His name is James Daniel Scott, JD to everyone who knows him, and he was born on May 27, 1976, in the Vancouver area of British Columbia, making him roughly 2 years older than Jonathan and Drew. The three boys grew up together on a horse ranch in Maple Ridge, the sons of Jim and Joanne Scott. Their father, Jim, had a remarkable background. A Scottish-born man who had worked in film as a stuntman and assistant director, and who also happened to be a karate instructor. He enrolled all three of his sons in martial arts from an early age. JD began training at 8 years old, and eventually all three brothers would earn black belts and become instructors themselves. But ranch life and martial arts were not the whole picture of JD's childhood. By multiple accounts, he was severely bullied growing up. As the oldest, he was always the first one through every unfamiliar door, the trailblazer who absorbed the blows before his younger brothers ever had to. That role, the older brother who goes first, shaped him in ways that would prove to matter enormously later in life. When the twins eventually became household names, the family developed a running joke about JD that stuck. Drew Scott once described his older brother as someone they kept hidden because they did not want him to outshine them. He called JD the good-looking one, even jokingly referring to him as the Brad Pitt of the family. It was affectionate, and JD has always taken it in good humor. But humor or not, it captured something real about his position in the story. He was the other one, the third Scott, the name most viewers could not place even if they had watched the show for years. What a lot of people do not realize is that JD was not simply a spectator to his brother's success. He was embedded in it from the very beginning. He co-founded the Scott Brothers production company back in 2002 and served as its creative director for years. He hosted behind-the-scenes content. He hosted the competition series Brother vs. Brother. He co-hosted a radio show with Jonathan and Drew. He hosted a separate television series focused on American amusement parks. He became a global ambassador for the humanitarian charity World Vision. He was also, at various points in his life, a blackjack dealer in Las Vegas and a celebrity impersonator, performing as Adam Lambert and David Bowie on stage. As a teenager in Canada, he had been part of a sketch comedy group. He was always a performer, always working. And yet, to the broader public, he remained largely invisible, essential to the operation, but absent from the spotlight. He once observed, not bitterly, but pointedly, that he felt his wife often went unacknowledged in the same way, because people were only ever interested in what the more famous brothers thought or did. Even when talking about being overlooked, JD turned the focus somewhere else. That says a great deal about the kind of person he is. In 2018, something began happening to JD Scott that would push every question about fame and identity completely off the table. What replaced those questions was far more urgent. It started quietly. A kind of mental haziness that would come and go, what JD later described as a brain fog that made things feel slightly off, slightly blurred. Not debilitating enough to stop him from functioning, but impossible to fully ignore. He was a busy man. He told himself it was stress. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself it was just the grind of a demanding career. The symptoms first appeared around the time of Drew's wedding to Linda Fan in 2018. And in the weeks after that wedding, the vague cognitive fog gave way to something far more alarming. JD experienced what felt, in every way, like a heart attack. His chest tightened. One arm went numb. His pulse raced. Pressure built in his head. And then there was something truly strange, a crawling sensation inside his skull, as though something were moving under the surface. He went to the hospital. They ran cardiac tests. His heart came back clean. He was told his heart was fine. But JD knew he was not fine. Whatever was happening to him, it was real, it was escalating, and nobody yet had a name for it. A neurologist would eventually identify the crawling sensation in his skull as a rare condition called nummular headache, a localized, coin-shaped pain pattern with unusual sensory characteristics. But naming that one symptom did nothing to address the full picture, because what came next was something far more cruel in its specificity. The single strangest and most limiting symptom of JD's illness was an extreme sensitivity to heat. Not a preference for cool rooms. Not mild discomfort on warm days. A physiological collapse. He has described it plainly. Once the temperature around him rose above 69 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, to be clear, room temperature for most people, his skin would feel like it was on fire. He would begin to lose consciousness. And the aftermath of those episodes could keep him out of commission for days at a time. He has since said that there were many moments during this period that felt like the end of the line. That phrase, the end of a line, is not dramatic exaggeration. It is the honest description of what it feels like to watch your world shrink down to nothing, with no explanation for why it is happening. He has since said that there were many moments during this period that felt like the end of the line. That phrase, the end of a line, is not dramatic exaggeration. It is the honest description of what it feels like to watch your world shrink down to nothing, with no explanation for why it is happening. He has since said that there were many moments during this period that felt like the end of the line. That phrase, the end of a line, is not dramatic exaggeration. It is the honest description of what it feels like to watch your world shrink down to nothing, with no explanation for why it is happening. He has since said that there were many moments during this period that felt like the end of a line. That phrase, the end of a line, is not dramatic exaggeration. It is the honest description of what it feels like to watch your world shrink down to nothing, with no explanation for why it is happening. He has since said that there were many moments during this period that felt like the end of a line. That phrase, the end of a line, is not dramatic exaggeration. It is the honest description of what it feels like to watch your world shrink down to nothing, with no explanation for why it is happening. The search for answers became its own kind of exhaustion. JD did not receive a swift diagnosis followed by a treatment plan. He received months of tests, specialist referrals, and inconclusive results. He would later describe the scale of what he went through during that period. He saw a rheumatologist, a radiologist, 3 separate neurologists, a neurosurgeon, and an ophthalmologist. He gave blood, a lot of it. On one occasion alone, 25 vials were drawn in a single appointment. He underwent roughly half a dozen MRIs, an MRA, and an EEG. The doctors cast a wide net. They considered the possibility of lupus. They investigated whether he might have a brain aneurysm. One radiologist told him with a high degree of certainty that he did not have an aneurysm, which should have been reassuring. But by that point, every door that closed without an answer felt less like relief and more like another dead end. Every clear result meant more months without an explanation, more months of suffering in the dark. By July of 2019, 14 months into his illness, JD decided it was time to speak. He posted a nearly 27-minute video on Instagram, sitting beside his fiancée, Annalie Bell, and told the world what he had been quietly carrying. He was careful to be direct. He was not looking for sympathy, and he was not interested in having his experience dismissed or doubted. He pointed out that pretending to be gravely ill would cost him, professionally, financially, personally, and asked what possible reason he would have to fabricate any of it. This was not a man seeking attention. This was a man who had been suffering privately for over a year, and had reached the point where silence was no longer something he could sustain. Somewhere in the middle of all of that, there was a night that JD has described in simple and devastating terms. He had an episode so severe that he genuinely believed he was not going to survive it. And so he did what you do when you believe you are about to die. He sat down and prepared. He gathered his passwords. He wrote out detailed estate instructions. He composed a message to Annalie containing everything she would need to handle his affairs if he did not make it to morning. He survived that night. But living through it did not answer the question of what was making him sick. That answer was still months away, and it would come through a coincidence so unlikely that it is almost hard to believe. The person at the center of JD's survival was Annalie Bell. She grew up in Amarillo, Texas, born in 1988, and she and JD had met in March of 2014 in Las Vegas, introduced by mutual friends at a bar in the city's arts district. By the time the illness struck, she was his fiancée. She also worked behind the scenes as a makeup artist and hairstylist on Property Brothers Productions. That last detail turned out to matter enormously. While working on the set of a Property Brothers episode, Annalie learned that one of the homeowners scheduled to appear on the show was a functional medicine doctor. She made the connection. Through that doctor and the different diagnostic framework he brought to the situation, the picture finally began to come into focus after more than a year of confusion. JD has never downplayed how much he owes her. In a message he shared publicly in mid-2019, he wrote that he could see Annalie carrying the weight of both of them, and that for that, she was his hero. He has said, in plain terms, that their relationship and her determination kept him alive. There is an additional layer to Annalie's strength that makes her role in this story even more meaningful. Years earlier, she had gone through something deeply painful of her own. Private content had been shared online without her consent, and she was subjected to sustained and brutal cyberbullying as a result. She has spoken openly about how that experience brought her to the lowest point of her mental health. She turned that pain into advocacy, speaking publicly about cyberbullying and mental health awareness. The woman who held JD together through his worst period was someone who already knew, from her own experience, what it meant to be at the bottom with no easy way out. In September of 2019, more than a year after JD's symptoms had first appeared, he shared the diagnoses that had finally been identified. And they came not as one answer but three. The first was a serious gastrointestinal infection, which had been identified and treated. On its own, that finding could account for a significant portion of what he had been suffering. The second finding was more complicated. JD revealed that he had been exposed to something known informally in patient communities as fluoroquinolone toxicity, sometimes called being fluxed. Fluoroquinolones are a class of powerful antibiotics, including medications like Cipro and Levaquin, whose names generally end in fluoxetine. In a subset of patients, these drugs have been associated with a serious and sometimes disabling syndrome that can affect muscles, tendons, nerves, and the central nervous system. JD said this finding aligned with both his symptoms and the timing of when they had begun. He encouraged his followers, in direct terms, to avoid any antibiotic with phlox in the name whenever there was a possible alternative. The third finding was the most startling of all. JD Scott had acute mercury poisoning. And not a borderline case. His mercury levels were high enough that the health department became involved. He did not yet know how the exposure had occurred, only that it was real and that treatment had begun. Mercury attacks the nervous system. It can produce the kind of cognitive fog, fatigue, sensory disruption, and physical symptoms that had been tormenting him for over a year. After 14 months of specialists, tests, and dead ends, the invisible enemy finally had a name. 3 names, in fact. Treatment began, and slowly, JD came back. By early November of 2019, he was sharing genuinely good news. He said he had felt almost like himself for several days in a row, that it had been so long since he had felt that way that it was genuinely remarkable. On the mercury treatment specifically, he reported that after 1 round, his levels had already dropped to half of what they had been. He was only slightly above the acceptable threshold, and after a bit more treatment, he expected to be clay. And then, in the same year that he had been writing out his estate instructions and preparing to say goodbye, he and Annalie got married. On October 31st, 2019, Halloween, exactly 1 year after they had gotten engaged, JD Scott and Annalie Bell were married in Las Vegas. The venue was a vintage movie theater. About 180 guests attended. The groomsmen, including Jonathan and Drew, dressed in video game character costumes. Annalie made her entrance on a black horse. It was not the somber, quiet affair you might expect from a couple who had just walked through that kind of darkness. It was loud and joyful and theatrical and full of color, A deliberate, full-throated celebration of the fact that they had made it through. In the years since, JD has returned to what he loves. He continues to appear on his brother's shows, host projects, and create the kind of comedy content he has always gravitated toward. In May of 2022, he and Annalie became aunt and uncle when Drew and Linda welcomed their son. And in a moment that felt like a genuine full circle, Jonathan and Drew renovated a home for JD and Annalie on an episode of Property Brothers, Forever Home, building them a comfortable, casual, and personal space to live in after everything they had been through together.